In the second week of September, 1780, a British officer camped in the North Carolina backcountry released a prisoner on parole and sent him home over the mountains carrying a message. What that message actually said is one of the strangest unsettled arguments in American history. We are going to come back to it at the end, because the answer is not the one you have heard, and it changes how you understand everything in between. The version almost every book gives you is this. The officer was Major Patrick Ferguson. The message was an ultimatum. If the men living west of the Blue Ridge did not lay down their arms and submit to the Crown, he would march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. By any reasonable measure, Ferguson was the right man in the right job. 20 years in uniform, an inventor whose breech-loading rifle had been demonstrated for King George himself, and he had just spent an entire summer doing something no other British officer in the American South had managed, turning ordinary American farmers into disciplined soldiers who would fight for the king. He had over 1,000 of them. They drilled, they held formation, they obeyed. What Ferguson had was a flank problem. West of him, past the mountains, sat settlements the British Empire had never governed and never much wanted to. The people there had a habit of riding down out of the passes, hitting loyalist positions, and vanishing back up them before anyone could respond. 4 weeks after that prisoner rode west, Ferguson was dead on a wooded ridge on the Carolina border, shot out of the saddle by men who had crossed 200 miles of mountain to find him. Every soldier under his command was killed, wounded, or a prisoner. And the British plan to win the American Revolution by reconquering the South, a plan that had been working almost flawlessly for nearly 2 years, was finished. Whatever was in that message, it did not deter anybody. It summoned them. 3 things about what happened on that ridge tend to get left out. The first is that the high ground was the trap. Ferguson chose his position deliberately and held it with total confidence, and in doing so put his men in the worst place on that landscape. The reason is physical, and it has to do with what happens to a musket ball fired downhill. The second is that of every man who fought there, Ferguson was the only British soldier present. Everyone else, the men he commanded, the men who killed him, the men who surrendered, and the men who refused to accept that surrender, was American. This was neighbors against neighbors, and both sides knew each other's names. The third, almost nobody mentions. The army that won this battle dissolved within about a week. No commission, no supply train, no government, no intention of staying. It formed for one purpose, accomplished it, and went home. It never fought together again, which leaves 2 questions worth carrying with you. How did a weapon that fired roughly 1 shot a minute beat a weapon that fired 3 or 4? And why did the side shooting downhill from higher ground with more men miss? To answer either, you have to understand why Britain needed those 1,000 American farmers in the first place. By 1779, the war had stopped being a colonial revolt and become something Britain could not afford. Saratoga cost them an entire army in 1777, and the diplomatic damage was worse than the military damage. France entered the war openly. Spain followed. Britain was suddenly fighting a global naval conflict with commitments in the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and India, and North America had gone from being the whole war to one theater among several, the one with the least obvious return. So London adopted a plan that required almost no additional troops. The rebellion's energy, the thinking went, sat in New England. The South was agricultural, hierarchical, bound to imperial trade, and reportedly full of colonists still loyal to the crown who wanted only a regular army to protect them. Take the ports. push inland. As royal authority returns, the loyal population comes forward, arms itself, and takes over, holding the countryside while the regulars move on. Province by province, the rebellion gets rolled up from Georgia northward. That is a strategy built on local partnership rather than occupation, which is the kind of thing that succeeds when it works. And it rested entirely on one assumption, that those loyal Americans existed in the numbers reported, and that once organized they could stand on their own. For a long while, the bet looked good. Savannah fell in December of 1778. In May of 1780, Charleston surrendered after a siege, sending roughly 5,500 American troops into captivity, one of the heaviest losses of the war. That August, Lord Cornwallis destroyed a hastily rebuilt American army at Camden, where the militia broke on first contact and the Continentals were cut apart piecemeal. 2 American armies annihilated in 3 months. The road north into Virginia stood open, which raises an obvious question. If the strategy was working this well, why did anyone need a militia at all? Because the map lied. The British controlled the coast, the towns, and the roads between them. What they did not control was the interior, and the interior had been at war with itself longer than the Continental Congress had existed. The Carolina backcountry had been filled in fast and unevenly by populations with little in common: Scotch-Irish Presbyterians down the Great Wagon Road, German settlers in their own communities, Highland Scots, and a coastal elite that regarded all of them as barely governable. Grievances over land titles, court access, and taxation predated the Revolution by a decade. When the imperial crisis arrived, it did not replace those fractures, it got absorbed into them. Choosing a side in 1780 often meant continuing a quarrel that had started over something else entirely. The result was a war fought at close range by people who could recognize each other on sight. Farms burned, livestock driven off, men hanged from their own trees by parties who knew exactly where they lived. Neither side had a monopoly on any of it. And then, in late May of 1780, British cavalry under Banastre Tarleton ran down a retreating Virginia regiment in the Waxhaws district. What happened is disputed and always will be. Tarleton's horse went down early, and his dragoons, believing their commander killed under a flag of truce, went through the Americans with sabers while a surrender was being attempted. More than 100 were killed outright. Whatever the intent, the effect was permanent. Tarleton's quarter entered the language of the backcountry as a phrase meaning no quarter at all. Patriot recruiters stopped needing arguments. They only needed the word. Against that backdrop, an insurgency took shape that the British never solved. Sumter in the north, Pickens on the frontier, Marion in the low-country swamps with forces sometimes measured in dozens. Cornwallis could beat any army sent against him. He could not beat this. To invade North Carolina, he needed the interior held behind him, and he lacked the regulars to do it. He needed the loyalist backbone the whole strategy had promised. And by that summer, one officer was already building it. Patrick Ferguson was born in Aberdeenshire in 1744, bought a commission at 15, and was unusual among regimental officers in one specific way. He thought seriously about weapons. In the early 1770s, he refined an existing breech-loading design into something formidable. A threaded plug dropped away when the trigger guard was rotated, letting ball and powder go in from the top, then sealed with a single turn. It could be reloaded lying down, which no standard musket could. It was rifled, so it was accurate. He fired it in pouring rain at a demonstration outside London and still hit targets at 200 yards. Then the story turns in a way that says a great deal about how 18th century armies worked. The rifles were expensive and slow to make, and the Board of Ordnance had no appetite for re-equipping an army. At Brandywine in 1777, Ferguson was shot through the right elbow. Surgeons wanted the arm. He refused and kept it, but it never worked again. While he lay recovering, his rifle corps was disbanded and the weapons put into storage. He learned to use a sword left-handed. Hold on to that, because it produces one of the sharpest ironies in American military history. The man who designed the best military rifle of his generation would die fighting men whose guns were better than the ones his own troops were carrying. In May of 1780, after Charleston fell, Sir Henry Clinton appointed him Inspector of Militia for the southern provinces, a post Ferguson had asked for, and one he wanted badly enough to give up a brevet lieutenant colonelcy to take. It is a small detail that tells you a lot. He was 36, still a major, and watching younger men pass him. He turned out to be startlingly good at the work, recruiting, drilling, appointing officers, writing out instructions. Observers noted that his militia did not behave like militia. Around a corps of about 100 provincial troops raised in New York and New Jersey, he assembled something over 1,000 men. Britain had asked for a backbone. Ferguson delivered a spine that would stand. Then the quality that made him effective turned against him. He had spent a summer watching Americans do what he told them, so when he looked west and saw an unresolved threat on his flank, he moved to settle it in advance. He had no real idea what was over there. What was over there was a society that had spent a decade learning nobody was coming to help it. West of the Blue Ridge, in the Watauga, Nolichucky, and Holston valleys, several thousand settlers lived in a legal gray zone. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 had forbidden settlement past the Appalachian crest. They crossed anyway, and because they were not supposed to be there, no colonial government ever extended real authority over them. So they built their own, written articles of association, an elected committee, a court, a militia. By 1780, they had governed themselves for 8 years and had never once needed permission from anybody. They were also veterans in the most literal sense. These settlements sat inside contested Cherokee territory, and the relationship had broken into open war more than once. Men who fought it had spent years learning to move quietly through timber, shoot accurately at distance, and expect ambush at every ridge. They also knew the British had been supplying the Cherokee with powder and lead, which made the empire not a political abstraction, but the specific reason there were guns in the hands of people who had burned their neighbors' cabins. Something set them in motion in the middle of September. The traditional answer is Ferguson's threat. There is a competing one from a man who was there, Arthur Campbell, a Virginia militia officer and kinsman of one of the leaders, recalled that what stirred the western settlements was not any message from Ferguson, but the arrival of about 150 Patriot refugees, driven out of Burke County and over the mountains after a skirmish at Cane Creek. They came in without their families. Their account of what was happening on the other side, Campbell wrote, was what raised the resentment of the militia. Either way, Isaac Shelby saw at once that defending was worthless. If Ferguson crossed when he chose, the fighting would happen in their own settlements with their own homes as the terrain. He rode about 40 miles to find John Sevier, and within a day the two had agreed. They would cross first. That was less obvious than it sounds. They were proposing to strip the settlements of every fighting man and march into territory held by a victorious enemy, against a target they could not locate, with no orders from any government and no authority to be there. They mustered at Sycamore Shoals on the 25th of September, roughly 1,000 men, funded by public money, a county official simply handed over on the reasoning that if the country was overrun, there would be no treasury left to protect. No uniforms, hunting shirts dyed brown and dull yellow, moccasins, a sprig of evergreen in the hat as the only field sign. No artillery, no wagons, no tents. Each man on his own horse with a blanket roll, parched corn, a knife, a tomahawk, and a long rifle. They crossed at Yellow Mountain Gap, where there was already snow, and came down the eastern slope, collecting more men until they numbered near 1,400. Two deserted during the crossing and rode to warn Ferguson. Rather than turning back, the commanders changed their route, which meant the intelligence he received 3 days later was already wrong. At a grazing ground called the Cowpens, they finally got what they had lacked for 2 weeks: a location. Ferguson was about 30 miles off, camped on a ridge and no longer moving. They cut roughly 900 of the best-mounted men out of the column and rode all night through cold rain. That rain matters twice over. It soaked powder, and it silenced the forest floor they were about to climb. Kings Mountain is not a mountain. It is a rocky spur roughly 600 yards long, standing 60 to 120 feet above the surrounding ground, narrow at one end and wider at the other. From above, it resembles a footprint or a spine. Ferguson looked at it and saw a fortress. He is reported to have said that he was king of that mountain and God Almighty could not drive him from it, a line that survived precisely because of what happened next, and one worth treating with some caution for the same reason. He built almost nothing. His supply wagons were drawn up along part of the crest, and that was the extent of it. No breastworks, no abatis, no felled timber, no earth thrown up anywhere. The professional consensus of the century said, "You fortified ground you meant to hold." Ferguson looked at the slope and decided the slope was enough. Two features of that ground made the decision fatal. The summit was bare and open. The slopes below it were thick timber and boulders. So the defenders stood exposed on a treeless crown while the attackers climbed through continuous cover, the exact inversion of what high ground is supposed to give you. Ferguson's men were silhouetted against open sky. The men shooting at them were behind trees. And then the weapons. Ferguson's militia carried smoothbore muskets, effective to perhaps 75 or 100 yards, fired in massed volleys and finished with the bayonet. That is the standard European system, and it is a good one. But many of his militiamen had no proper bayonets at all, and had improvised by lashing butcher knives into their musket barrels. The over-mountain men carried American long rifles, slower to load, no bayonet, useless in a volley, but rifled with grooved barrels that spun the ball and held it true past 200 yards. These were not battlefield weapons in the European sense. They were hunting tools built for one man taking one considered shot at something that would not stand still, and the men holding them had been doing exactly that since childhood. Which brings us to the physics. Shooting downhill, a soldier consistently fires high. Gravity acts on less of the ball's flight path than his instincts expect, and a man on a slope aiming at movement below him naturally raises his muzzle. Trained troops correct for it. Militia under fire for the first time do not. So the Loyalists fired down the slope, and the volleys went over the heads of the men climbing toward them, and the riflemen looked up, picked individual targets standing against the sky, and did not miss. The high ground had stopped being a fortress. It had become a stage. The Patriots reached the base around 3 in the afternoon on the 7th of October, tied their horses, split into 8 columns, and moved into position around the entire ridge. Nobody stopped them. The wet leaves gave nothing away, and the pickets were taken before they could raise an alarm. By the time the Loyalists understood what was happening, they were surrounded on ground with no way off it. William Campbell's order to his men, as it comes down to us, was to shout like hell and fight like devils. What followed was a scream borrowed from Cherokee warfare, often described as an ancestor of the rebel yell of 80 years later, coming out of the trees on every side at once. Ferguson did what his training told him to do, and it very nearly worked. He formed his men and sent them down the slope with bayonets fixed. The riflemen, with nothing to parry a bayonet, fell back down the hill exactly as they were supposed to. Then the trap closed on its own. The charge could not hold together on a steep, timbered slope. The line came apart among the trees. And when the Loyalists reached the bottom and had to climb back up to reform, the riflemen simply turned around, put trees between themselves and the ridge, and shot them in the back the whole way up. He ran that cycle repeatedly. Each time he spent men he could not replace and gained nothing, while pressure built on whichever side of the ridge he had stripped to launch the charge. With the encirclement complete, every answer to one threat opened another. He was impossible to miss. A light-colored horse, a checked hunting shirt pulled over his uniform, and a silver whistle to push orders through the noise, because with one arm crippled he could not do much else. Every man on that hillside knew who he was. When the Loyalists had been compressed into a shrinking pocket at the narrow end of the ridge, Ferguson made his decision. He spurred his horse straight at the Patriot line with his sword out, trying to cut a way through. Several rifle balls hit him almost at once. He came out of the saddle with one foot caught in the stirrup, and his horse dragged him along the rocks. The whole engagement had lasted a little over an hour. Captain Abraham de Peyster, a New Yorker, taking command of a Loyalist force from a dead Scot on an American mountain, raised a white flag. The firing did not stop. Men who had lost family in the backcountry war, who had been hearing about Waxhaws for 4 months, kept shooting into a surrendering packed body of men at close range, shouting Tarleton's quarter and Buford's play. Flags of truce went up and were shot down more than once. It took Campbell, Shelby, and Sevier riding in among their own troops, knocking rifle barrels aside with their hands and shouting to stop it. The final accounting varies by source, which is itself part of this story. Somewhere between 150 and nearly 300 Loyalists were killed, more than 160 wounded, and close to 700 taken prisoner. Fewer than 30 Patriots died. The killing did not end on the mountain. A week later, at Bickerstaff's old fields, the victors convened a drumhead court and condemned 36 prisoners. 9 were hanged from an oak before Shelby, and others stepped in and stopped it. Then the army that had done all this simply came apart. Within days, the men were riding back over the mountains to their farms because harvest was waiting and nobody had ever enlisted them in anything. Cornwallis learned of it at Charlotte and abandoned his invasion of North Carolina, pulling back to winter quarters at Winnsboro. The damage went far past one lost detachment. The whole strategy assumed Loyalists would come forward once shown that the Crown could protect them. Kings Mountain demonstrated the opposite. Declare for the King, and your neighbors will come for you, and no British army will arrive in time. Backcountry recruiting collapsed and never recovered, leaving Cornwallis to spend irreplaceable regulars on work his militia was supposed to have done. The delay bought time as well. Nathanael Greene took over the Southern Command that December and did what no American general had tried, divided his army in the face of a stronger enemy and refused Cornwallis the decisive battle he needed. In January, Daniel Morgan destroyed Tarleton's command at the Cowpens, the same grazing ground where the Overmountain men had cut their strike force 3 months earlier. In March, Cornwallis won at Guilford Courthouse and lost roughly a quarter of his army doing it. In October of 1781, he surrendered at Yorktown. Thomas Jefferson, writing decades afterward, called Kings Mountain the turn of the tide of success. For once, the phrase is not inflation. It is the point where a working British strategy stopped working. But the story does not close cleanly at Yorktown, and the reason is in the title. The victory did not calm the backcountry. It licensed what came next. Through the 1780s, Patriot authorities and unofficial parties seized Loyalist land and property across the Carolina interior, pushing families west into country that belonged to somebody else. That displacement is the least examined consequence of the Southern campaign. Carried out on that wave by tradition were two men from a Loyalist household in North Carolina, Micajah and Wiley Harp, usually called brothers, though some accounts make them cousins. Their origins are genuinely uncertain. Almost everything told about their early years comes from writing done decades later, and the specific claim that they were at Kings Mountain rests on very thin evidence. What is documented is what they became. Through the 1790s, they killed travelers and settlers across Tennessee and Kentucky with a randomness and a cruelty that appalled a frontier already accustomed to violence. Historians generally credit them with at least 39 murders and possibly more than 50. They are commonly identified as the first serial killers in the American record. Micajah was hunted down and killed in Kentucky in 1799. Wiley drifted south and joined a river pirate gang operating along the road between Nashville and Natchez and was hanged in 1804. That road ran about 440 miles through Chickasaw and Choctaw country, and it carried a very specific kind of traffic. Boatmen floated cargo down the Ohio and the Mississippi, sold their flatboats for lumber at the far end, and walked home overland with the proceeds in their pockets. A steady stream of men on foot, alone, in deep forest, carrying cash. It was the most reliably profitable place in the West to rob somebody, and it was robbed accordingly. Travelers gave it a name they used without irony. They called it the Devil's Backbone. The name did double duty. Part of it was the country itself, the ridges, the swamps, the sheer punishment of walking 500 miles through wilderness. But the name stuck and spread because of the men waiting along it, which closes a circle nobody intended. The British wanted a backbone in the South and built one out of their neighbors. It was broken on a ridge shaped like a spine in about an hour by men who went home immediately afterward, and some of those it broke were scattered west into a country that eventually named a road for them. Which brings us back to the message. Almost every account of Kings Mountain leads with Ferguson's threat of fire and sword. It is the reason the story works. A villain announces himself, and the men he threatened come over the mountain and kill him. The problem is where that quotation comes from. It comes from a pamphlet Isaac Shelby published in 1823, 43 years after the battle, when Shelby had been twice governor of Kentucky and was defending his own reputation in a dispute over who deserved credit for the victory. Every later version, including the one Lyman Draper printed in his 1881 history, and every book that has drawn on it since, traces back to those 40-odd words. When another veteran published the story in 1845, he reproduced it almost verbatim 22 years later and hundreds of miles away, which is not how independent memory works. Meanwhile, the contemporary record is silent. A newspaper account printed 6 weeks after the battle described Ferguson as having advanced to Gilbert Town and threatened to cross the mountains, and said nothing about hanging anyone or burning anything. A researcher going through more than 300 statements by men who served on that campaign found no mention of a threat from Ferguson at all. And there is a document. Ferguson's own proclamation, dated the 9th of September, 1780, survives in Cornwallis's papers because Ferguson mailed a copy to him. It runs some 850 words, and it is an appeal, not an ultimatum. It argues that the people have been misled. It offers pardon and protection, and it explicitly instructs loyalist militia to leave alone the persons and property of former rebels who go home peacefully, and to protect women and children of every description, promising to punish plunderers on his own side as harshly as any enemy. In his letter to Cornwallis, Ferguson explained how he was distributing it, through paroled prisoners chosen deliberately for their character and moderation so the message would arrive intact. So the most quoted sentence in the story of Kings Mountain was probably never said. That does not make the mobilization a fiction. Something moved 1,000 men across an 8,000-foot mountain range in September. It may have been the refugees from Burke County. It may have been that Shelby received Ferguson's offer of protection and simply did not believe a word of it, because whatever Ferguson was writing, other British officers in the Carolinas were already doing the other thing, and everyone west of the Blue Ridge knew the name Waxhaws. That is the honest shape of it. A competent officer chose strong ground and defended it exactly as he had been trained to. Everything he did was correct by the standards of the army that trained him, and all of it was wrong for that hill, that weather, and those men. And the sentence he is remembered for, the one carved into the whole American telling of this battle, was most likely written by the man it made a hero, 4 decades after the shooting stopped, by someone who understood that a story needs a villain to say something unforgivable out loud. Ferguson may never have promised anyone fire and sword. In the end, it did not matter what he wrote. It mattered what they believed, and they had their reasons.